Okay, in the last part of this lecture 3, after we've dealt with demand and what determines it, supply and what determines it, the last thing I want to deal with is where the demand and supply curve meet, which is called the equilibrium. It's how we basically then describe the marketplace working. So first we're going to talk about how the equilibrium is found, calculate the equilibrium, and then talk about how that equilibrium changes when the demand curve changes and the supply curve changes. Okay, so equilibrium, again, kind of the way that it's defined is it's the point where there would be no tendency for change. Although quite simply in our description it can be seen as the point where the demand curve and the supply curve meet. So we have quantity on the x-axis, price of the good on the y-axis, and again, if we stick with telephones here as our example, we would have our downward sloping demand curve that we know is downward sloping because of the law of demand, our upward sloping supply curve that we know is upward sloping from the law of supply, and if we put them in the same space, then we can clearly see that they meet. The point where they meet is our equilibrium. And I'm going to label this Q star and P star. Now the reason why that's important is because if you remember back from classical political economy and even neoclassical economics, there's a great deal of emphasis on equilibrium and a laissez-faire philosophy, right? Or letting the government have a hands-off approach to letting the marketplace work. Because what we would see here is that if there's no intervention, theoretically, by the government, the market on its own would find P star and Q star. Now why is that the case? What if the price was wrong, or what if the quantity was wrong? What if instead of P star, it was P1, where P1 is greater than P star? Then following that horizontal line across, what we would see is that the quantity demanded, which is right here, would exceed the quantity supplied. When quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, we call that, right, in this case here, I'm sorry. Unfortunately with videos, it's one-way interaction, so you can't necessarily correct me here. It's not that quantity demand is greater than quantity supplied. It's the other way around. That quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. Now, what we would call that then is a surplus, right? There's more stuff being produced than there is being purchased. Now, we all know what happens, though, when that happens in real life, right? Like, I remember once buying this pair of, like, corduroy pants, and the corduroy pants are this, like, green color, like this, I think they're called lawn color, right? And they look really ugly, like, there's just no better way to say it. And the reason why I bought them was because, right, they were at J. Crew, they were a nice pair of corduroy pants in this green color, but also J. Crew had marked down the price significantly, right, because they'd realized, boy, no one's going to buy this really ugly green color pair of corduroy pants. So they lowered the price to get rid of the excess, right? And what ends up happening, right, this is the first thing that happens, is that the price starts to fall. Now, as that price falls, two things happen, right? From the law of demand, what do we know? Is that as the price falls, the quantity demanded rises. We know that from the law of demand. And we can see here a movement along the demand curve. What also happens is that as the price falls, right, the quantity supplied falls. That would be the law of supply. And the consequence of that is that we also have a movement along the supply curve. Notice what happened here is that the market essentially fixed itself. It had a surplus because the price was too high. And then either through buyers sending signals to the firms or the firms sending signals to the buyers, doesn't really matter which way it was, is that the price was lowered. It's the price. It's the ability of the price to adjust that fixes this disequilibrium of a surplus. If for whatever reason the price cannot adjust, then the market will not find its equilibrium. Now let's look at the opposite example of a shortage. A shortage would exist when the price is below the equilibrium. At that point, the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. This is a shortage. What happens, right, is that if you're a firm and you're selling something and there's not enough of it out there, right, what ends up happening is that the price starts to increase. As the price increases, right, then the quantity demanded falls from the law of demand. And as the price increases, the quantity supplied increases. Law of supply. And we see that right here. And we see the movement along the demand curve and along the supply curve. I mean, in some sense, it's, economic beauty, right? Because what ends up happening here is that the price falling moves us back to that equilibrium. Price rising moves us back to this equilibrium. And no one had to, the beauty of the market here in this case is that no one has to have any special knowledge about what people really want. I mean, you can get it wrong, and oftentimes firms do get it wrong. Consumers can get it wrong, right? And you can dramatically price something, right? There's a famous example of, when Apple made some of its first Macintosh computers. They were called the Lisa. And the Lisa computer back in the early 80s costed something like $10,000 or $11,000. And it failed. It failed because no one had that kind of money just to buy a computer, right? And we can think of other examples that exist today. Right, things like, when the iPhone first came out, right, is that the price was set, although it was a high price, what many of us would think of as a high price, right, there was a lot of demand for it, so much demand for it, right, that Apple stores ran out of the product, right, and then you had to wait for the product to come into stock, right, and Apple was able to do that, right, by raising the price, right, so shortages and surpluses are fixed by, in some sense, greed, right? Either the firm realizing that it needs to get rid of a product that isn't selling, so it lowers the price and tries to capture whatever revenue it can, or by raising the price because it realizes it's selling something very popular, right? Now, with that said, let's talk about then how to calculate an equilibrium here, right? So now what we're going to do here is we're going to look at a set of supply and demand equations. Now, for our demand curve, we know that it has to have a form where there's a negative sign in that equation. And we know that there has to be a negative sign because of the law of demand, which says that there's an inverse relationship between the price and the quantity, which theoretically is over on the left-hand side of this equation. And then our supply curve would show the positive relationship between price and quantity. Now, to solve for the equilibrium, what we do is we set the two equations equal to one another. Okay? So we're going to set the 100 minus 2p equal to 30 plus 6p.